Somewhere out in cyberspace, they're filling in the human race on cloud computing's latest tech or the history of the internet. What will they cover this time? I hope it's robots or AI. Their agile minds crunch the data fast to bring you the Clearly Cloud podcast.
All right, Conrad, banter, be funny.
You can't just say be funny
Yes, you
and
can.
banter.
Dude, I do it to you all the time. You're funny. Like on command. It's like I clap and you're funny. Be funny.
Not all the time. You know, sometimes you got to get warmed up.
We're doing a podcast. It's supposed to be fun. Oh, wait. We're doing a podcast and we're recording. People are listening right now. I guess I got to do the intro, right?
Yeah. What did we call this? The cloud couple?
Yeah, well, it's not the Conrad Show. All right, everybody, welcome to the first episode of the Clearly Cloud podcast. So our goal is, between Conrad and I, is to explore the history, the impacts, and the future of the cloud. And Conrad wanted to talk about what we're not. What are we not, Conrad?
Well, I think what's important when you listen to a podcast to know what you're not going to get out of it, because sometimes that's even better. It's not like a sales pitch or advertising. This is not the place where it's like, how do you install a virtual machine on AWS or Azure? There's a ton of stuff on there, but I think we really wanted to kind of focus on some different corners of the cloud, if you will, as if there were corners. I guess that breaks the model because there's no boundaries, right?
Well, what I think is great about it is I do like the weekly tech talks, which are very tactical. But meanwhile, like we sit around and we talk about what the future is and what's actually changing with the cloud. And we do it with some really cool people. And we really wanted to expose that to everybody. And today's guest, David Pryor, is the Director of External Affairs at Microsoft. And he's going to tell an awesome story about what it took to get the Cloud Act passed, but also talk about like the implications of privacy and trust with the cloud. Well, a lot of us just take it for granted.
Yeah, well, let's not overlook that he's also going to tell a terrible joke, which I love.
Well, we're all going to tell terrible jokes.
No, it's true.
Well, you can't help it. Be funny. See?
You can't do that.
So really, thank you, everybody, for joining us for our inaugural podcast. We've got a lot to talk about. Today was a big week in the cloud. We had the big four tech companies up on an antitrust hearing in the House. Microsoft Inspire was the week before. We're starting to look forward. Well, we just heard that E3 was going to be canceled. Yeah, there's just a lot going on. And our goal is to bring you the most pertinent news, some really informative guests. And some of our guests lined up in the future are the former director of the FBI Science and Technology Division, Katie Arrington, the CISO for...
She's really the leader of
Secretary of Defense. But yes, she was the mastermind behind CMMC, like this big new federal cybersecurity regulations coming out. And our goal is to introduce you to these people and get insights in a friendly, informative way that's not just bogged down in infrastructure. And occasionally we're going to tell bad dad jokes.
4, 3, 2, 1, having some fun with guests.
So today, our special guest on the Clearly Cloud podcast is David Pryor, Director of External Affairs at Microsoft. How are you doing today, David?
Hey, Sean, it's great to be here. Thank you. This is a great honor for me and Microsoft to join this inaugural podcast.
Oh, well, thank you for being our first guest. Why don't we just get started by asking you, who are you, David, and what do you do?
Wow, that's a loaded question, Sean, but let me just start back with my upbringing. I was born in Arkansas. I was born into a political family. We've always been engaged in politics and campaigns and public service. My father was, the year I was born, he ran for office, and I have been engaged ever since. He was in the House of Representatives. He was governor of Arkansas and a U.S. senator for 18 years. And then my brother, my younger brother actually, also was attorney general of Arkansas and served in the U.S. Senate in my father's former seat.
Well, it is.
That's quite a background. It makes me envious. One of my favorite shows is The West Wing. I'm like, how cool would it be to be so involved with the government? You live that life, your whole life. That's awesome.
Well, yes, Conrad, sometimes you have to be careful what you wish for, but it was a fantastic experience, a great life. And I was thrilled and honored to, be a part of that.
Well, it's obviously led to kind of the next chapter, which we're going to talk about.
Yeah. And so now you're involved with an organization called VFI, and this is Voices for Innovation. What is VFI for our listeners?
Yes. Listen, Sean, first of all, let me clarify. I work in Microsoft U.S. government affairs, as you mentioned, and I work in the Washington, D.C. office. Now, what does that mean? VFI, or Voices for Innovation, is a group that is meant to empower technology advocates. And my first 10 years at Microsoft, I've been here about 11 and a half, 12 years. My first 10 years at Microsoft, I was the Senate Democratic lobbyist. I went to the Hill every day. I prepped Brad Smith for briefings, meetings with senators, kept a pulse, and really kept track of what was happening in the Senate on a wide array of technology issues, which we will get into. But now I'm managing Voices for Innovation, which really is an advocacy arm of the Government Affairs Office. But we ask people like you to get engaged in the political process.
Great. And then, so there are a number of initiatives you guys are involved in. What are some of those?
Well, we cover, as you can imagine, the tech ecosystem is very broad. Technology impacts and affects literally everything we do, but specifically privacy, workforce development, cybersecurity, things like China, immigration, artificial intelligence is a huge new issue for us. And of course, facial recognition those are a few of the key issues that we are working on.
And that facial recognition has been really big in the news recently. So how does somebody join VFI?
Well, first of all, it's free. VFI is meant to empower advocates, so we don't charge fees. There's no obligation to join. Sean, you and I met just less than a year ago in California at one of these conferences. You joined immediately, got instantly engaged, and I've always been impressed by Agile IT's just engagement and involvement. And one thing you do get out of VFI is an executive briefing, which is just a compendium or list of policy articles that we feel are very important to tech advocates, and it covers those issues that I spoke of.
And I have to say, I look forward to that briefing every week. Every Friday, I get an email from you guys, and there's 5 to 8 stories about what's shaping tech policy. And a lot of what I read is very tactical and what's going on that day. And with the briefing, what I get is I get more information on what's going to be shaping technology over the next 5 or 6 years, where these are really cataclysmic changes, almost at the level of the Cloud Act that we're going to talk about here in a bit.
Yeah.
Yes, Sean. Go ahead, Conrad.
Yeah, what I thought was interesting was when Sean made that event and came down, I think it was the IMCP. And normally, those events it was okay. This particular one was actually a really good one, but he came back so energized. He's like, Conrad, I got to tell you about this guy named David Pryor. and it was like the timing was perfect, because we even think for ourselves as this, kind of smaller company here in SoCal. And we talk, Sean and I, we talk all the time about politics, but we also have politics, and technology, how those come together. And so him meeting you was just so exciting. And knowing that now there's this avenue that we could participate in all the things that we were doing, it felt like we could actually be a part of this. And because before, being this small company in SoCal, what can we do? And it was just this ability to play into all these other areas. And then we had this magnificent lunch with you in DC, and it just kind of grew from there. And it just feels like this accessibility to participate in something. And I just didn't know it was that easy and that close. So it was awesome meeting. We just love participating.
Well, Conrad, thank you. Your entire team has just really been spectacular. I love the Agile IT story on cloud services. The fact that you are doing this podcast is just very forward leaning. But let me go back and answer Sean's question. Frankly, just go to voicesforinnovation.org and click the join button. It's that simple. We'll send you the executive briefing. We will never send you a bill. We started VFI about 15 years ago because, listen, let's face it, we were getting our butts kicked, I'll tone down my language, by the Department of Justice on an antitrust suit. I'm sure that may have been before Sean's time, but I will tell you that antitrust and these regulatory issues do shape the tech ecosystem. And that's why we started this, so our Microsoft partners could get involved. Since then, we've expanded VFI to include other technology companies and small business owners, chambers of commerce, and people that just care and are passionate about technology.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I mean, you guys, and Microsoft has always been that way. And by the way, I was at Microsoft when that whole thing was happening, way back in the day. And it was shocking, right? Because it was like, we're just, a software company delivering software. Like, oh my, what's happening? Legislation can actually have this impact. So doing something about it was important. But I think the thing that you just said, what I think is great, which is, you start with partners because that's how you scale. But this is for any one of those businesses. They can go sign up and make their voices heard. So I think that's really cool.
And if I could just take the liberty for one moment, just to turn the tables and ask a question of either one of you. Why did you join VFI? I mean, we met, we had a great time. We probably had a couple of beers at the bar, but I mean, Conrad, you talked briefly about it, but Sean, why did you join VFI? And frankly, why did you sign the letter to the FCC about expanding access to rural broadband in these communities that don't have it?
Really, it comes down to my son. That being a father just changes everything about how you look at the world. And that first night that we met, you were talking about privacy and cybersecurity and advocating to change policies. And about a month prior, I had gotten an email from my son's school saying that, oops, the San Diego Unified School District had somehow just lost every social security number, birth date, and name of every student in the district, including my son. And I, of course, as a father, I'm piping mad. He's too young for identity theft. This is insane. And so hearing that this was one of the things that VFI advocated for, I was, of course, very interested. And then I was getting the briefings and I was reading it, and the initiative for rural broadband, and I'll let you speak a little bit more on what that initiative was, but it was to reach out and petition Ajit Pai, the commissioner of the FCC, to open up bandwidth on the television spectrum, right?
Yes, that's correct.
In order to enable rural broadband. And I had moved back down to San Diego from Northern California up in Mendocino County. I lived on 44 acres in the middle of the redwoods. I made my own power, pumped my own water, and my internet there was either cellular or radio. And it was slow, and I ran a business, and having to go to town to do things, and opening up rural broadband, particularly with what's going on with COVID-19, if we still lived up there, my son wouldn't be able to do Zoom meetings or Teams meetings with his classmates, the rich online educational opportunities. And so I just felt that rural broadband was a no-brainer. It expands opportunities for every American. And yeah, when it was, hey, we need people to sign this letter, I really cultured it out to the company and said, hey, anybody who's interested in this, please sign the letter. And everybody in the company did. I think there was one person who didn't. And then when we heard, and the next briefing had links to the tweets about they were going to move on this. And I told everybody, and it was a collective cheer. Everybody in the company had felt so empowered that they'd made a difference. And it really energized us for quite a while about that, because we were able to see our impact into the world. A lot of times when you're working in tech, you're in a virtual server closet. You don't really see what the overarching impacts are. And to get those stories and to understand that was just huge for us.
Listen, I just love that story. And now I do remember it over a couple of beers at the bar in Southern California. But I will say that, you've tapped into a couple of things that are so important to VFI. And that's number one, you were passionate about the loss of this data, especially your son's data, and you acted on it. You got engaged. You learned more, you saw this opportunity, and you decided not to sit around in your IT closet and hope it got better. Because as we know, it doesn't usually get better unless you engage and act. And I'm sorry, you'll hear me use the word engagement a lot during the next 30 minutes or so. But it is very important for people like you that care, that are passionate, not just to engage at a federal level, but get involved in your community, the school system that lost your son's data. I mean, obviously you were on it. You got engaged. You were upset. And I hope that situation has been rectified or certainly clarified. But that's what VFI encourages advocates to do, is start local, engage local, lean in, learn a lot about an issue, and then find your voice. And getting that voice helps you become an advocate that you can take to Washington, D.C. and sit with a senator, or even at the White House. A lot of our broadband stuff, we've been to the White House and to the Hill several times, and VFI has made a difference. And if I could give one example, VFI, we found some constituents in Paul Ryan's district. We'll get into the Cloud Act in just a moment. But Paul Ryan was the House Majority Leader just a couple of years ago. Mm-hmm. And we found VFI constituents in his district. Someone had his cell phone number or something, and we got a meeting with Paul Ryan and this VFI advocate. We had trained this person, given them great talking points. They were already passionate about it like you are, but he went in and really laid out a great case. And we think that's how Paul Ryan got to understand how important it was for this issue to be addressed. And it was, and we can get into that later in the podcast.
Great. Thank you, David. So let's move to the Cloud Act. So there's some really compelling stories around it, and there's a little bit more focus on it because of some of the stuff that's been occurring around the world right now. But can you start by just explaining what the Cloud Act is?
Yes. And let me clarify with your listeners, I am not an attorney. I am not a policy analyst. I'm an advocate. So I want to stay at a fairly high level, but the Cloud Act is something. The cloud itself is relatively new. We know this. I've been reading. Brad Smith has a fantastic book, and I'm not trying to sell books here, but there's a book called Tools and Weapons: The Promise and the Peril of the Digital Age. And in his introduction, the very first sentence is, civilization has always run on data. And if you look at the arc of data collection, starting with, campfires and where to hunt and where to fish and how to farm, going all the way to, Gutenberg and this just rapid acceleration of data collection and libraries being built and shared. Now you have the cloud, the world's filing cabinet. Everybody is using the cloud now. 10 years ago, I don't know how many people were using the cloud, but if you look back, this acceleration into the cloud, massive big data going in for AI and all types of data crunching has just literally accelerated what we're doing, not just in IT, but in actually data protection, data transfer, securing that data, and just the business that you guys know more about than I do. So let me start quickly. The Cloud Act started basically because Microsoft, who has data centers overseas, of course, we got a warrant from the U.S. authorities. It was a drug trafficking case. We looked at the warrant. We're always very respectful and responsive to valid law enforcement warrants because we want to stop the bad guys too. But sometimes we feel that there's been a bit of an overreach and a little bit of erosion of what I would say privacy rights around data. And it's because the laws are very old. The laws governing that data, frankly, are almost 30 years old. That's the Electronic Communications Privacy Act. I won't get into the details. But the Cloud Act started because we were served with the warrant. We looked at the warrant. It wasn't even a U.S. citizen. Furthermore, the data resided in our Irish data center. Now, you would think that the U.S. authorities could not pluck something out of Ireland. So we contested the warrant. We basically said we weren't going to comply. The U.S. government went after us. We went to court. At the same time, we started a legislative process in the House and the Senate because we know that advocacy and changing regulations and laws and rules and everything else that affect data, you have to start on many tracks. So we started this dual track. We eventually went to the Supreme Court, Sean, and this was just in 2018. This was very recent, but the battle took 4 years to get there.
Wow.
And in the meantime, we're still protecting the data. We still believe that we have to be we are the protectors and custodians of the customer's data. Now, you guys are our partners, Microsoft partners, but at the end of the day, it falls to us to protect our customers' data. That includes Agile IT's data. So we were very protective of that. Now, what happens next? The Supreme Court gets all the way to the Supreme Court, and the congressional track that I just mentioned, it also matured and developed. And at the same time, we were able to attach the Cloud Act to a bill. Now, it's very difficult to get what I call the four corners. That's the House and Senate, Republicans and Democrats, to all agree to something. However, we were able to get that agreement. I won't go into the sausage making, but I will say one of my great stories from that time is sitting down on the morning of the Supreme Court case with Brad Smith. He and I were at breakfast with Senator Chuck Schumer. Senator Schumer was the minority leader and still is at this time, but Brad laid out the case on the need for the Cloud Act. And Brad, of course, had to quickly get up and finish his breakfast and go over to the Supreme Court because you can't miss that court date. But at the end of the day, that relationship between Brad and Senator Schumer really helped when we had to get the Senate Ds in line. So what I'm saying is you have to work hard. These advocacy tracks that we follow and work on constantly 24/7, you can't let your guard down. So the court case was rendered moot by congressional action because the Cloud Act did pass in September 18, early first quarter 2018. Let me stop there. You may have a question.
So you mentioned Brad Smith. For our listeners, who is he?
Brad Smith is the president of Microsoft and was the former general counsel for many, many years.
Okay.
No, I think that's, I love that story, and, just about the work and that you and so many other people had to go do to kind of get it there. And then, and then get it signed. And I think, part of this cloud benefit isn't just that economies of scale that we get from computing and capabilities of performance, but now that Microsoft has this responsibility for managing all that, just not the infrastructure, but the legal side of it and the legislation. And it wasn't like, oh, okay, we'll just do whatever we want. But at the same time, if people can't trust it, or they can't trust the They can't trust us as a partner. They can't trust the vendor or Microsoft providing the services, where they'll just take whatever. It kind of breaks that whole model. So it's great that not only is Microsoft fighting for itself, but Voices for Innovation is saying, be a part of it, which I think, only helps add to the case of helping get that legislation through.
And Conrad, I would agree. And I just want to humanize this a bit. We Sean and I have talked about this, but just to keep it, at the human level, in Brazil, for example, one of our Microsoft employees that ran our Microsoft office in Brazil was actually put in jail for not turning over data to Brazilian authorities. Now, I don't know if you guys are worldwide or maybe you have an office somewhere out in the US, but can you imagine one of your employees actually being put in jail because they didn't comply with a subpoena or a warrant? So I just wanted to bring that in because I think it does add color, and because you guys are so deep into cloud infrastructure, I hope you would think about that. You cannot take this lightly, as you just said. You have to get engaged, because one day it could affect you. It could affect your employees. And frankly, it could affect your business model overnight. With an adverse ruling or a law or something that comes along, your whole business model could shift, and maybe you don't do so well. But hopefully tools like Voices for Innovation and hopefully Microsoft partners and folks that work for I know you have multiple cloud tenants, Amazon, Google, et cetera. It's important to look at the whole tech ecosystem, not just Microsoft's, but to really be passionate about the entire ecosystem.
And I like how Conrad was talking about scale earlier. And when we previously talked about the Cloud Act, I can't remember who said it, but it was that prior to that, there was no way to be legal on a global scale. And it's not just looking at all the clouds. We have to look at all the countries, and the cloud has no borders.
You're exactly right. And listen, GDPR is a great example of that. GDPR, and I know it's the general data, whatever it is. I told you I'm not a lawyer. I just know the acronym. But when we heard about GDPR, what Microsoft decided to do, we knew it was coming. So 2 years in advance, we had 2 years because they told us it would be 2 years before enacted. So what we did in the 2 years, we modified all the algorithms, all the privacy protections, all of the things that would affect not employees, but actually customers globally. We use the GDPR as the minimum, as the lowest common denominator, if you will, so that everything complied with this lowest common denominator on privacy protections. And we did the same thing, Sean, with California's law here in the U.S., which is very strict.
Yes, the CCPA.
Yes, CCPA. And so what Microsoft is good at is looking out a few years. Of course, in the tech world, you can't look out too far, but you can prepare and plan. And CCPA, GDPR, and now look at Privacy Shield. We try to anticipate what's happening and then gear up and what I would call turn the battleship just a bit to align with where the world is likely to go.
Great. So you mentioned sitting down with Chuck Schumer. And what were his reasons for getting in line behind the Cloud Act?
Well, listen, Brad Smith is a guy that has arrived at where he is because he's extremely smart. He has been doing this a very long time. He was there, Conrad, during the antitrust days, as you may recall, at Microsoft, and he shaped that case. And he has always been passionate about what we do in Washington. And that is great because I know some technology companies, the CEOs, do not want to come to Washington. They do not want to testify. By the way, there's a huge hearing today in the House with, the leaders of Amazon, Google, Facebook, and others, Apple. It's a big hearing. It's a big deal. We'll get into Techlash in just a minute. But what I was saying is that Brad Smith doesn't need a lot of prompting, although I did write his briefing paper for him for that meeting. Brad can speak on his own from his own experience. And he basically, Chuck Schumer didn't need a lot of convincing, but the primary argument was privacy protections. Just like your child's data was compromised, Brad made the case that law enforcement authorities, whether it's U.S. or global, cannot access our customer data without the appropriate legal standards and processes and laws. And Schumer saw that. He got it. He saw it was a privacy protection. He wanted to protect, America has been built on the IT industry, and he wants to protect that industry, safeguard it, and clarify these old 30-year-old rules that govern electronic data.
So when you were talking about the Microsoft employee in Brazil who was arrested, it almost sounds like Microsoft is reluctant to cooperate. And I know that's not the case in every situation. There was another compelling story that happened right around that same time around the terrorist attacks in France. And
yes.
What was that all about?
Well,
that was super fast.
And listen, that was Charlie Hebdo, I think, is the incident you were referring to, where a shooter walked into an office, or I think it was actually a newspaper, and shot multiple people. We were contacted immediately by Interpol, or one of the foreign enforcement agencies, and said, listen, this shooter has a Hotmail account. We can see it on his phone or something. And typically you go through a process. It's called the MLAT process, where there's treaties between two countries on how they transfer data, how law enforcement can share data, and that kind of thing. And we are very strict about this data because there's privacy protections, there's safeguards, it has to be the appropriate legal stuff. But in this instance, Sean, we turn that data over in about 45 minutes because we know that, look, this is a bad guy. We need to catch him. So there are exceptions and times when you have to have the flexibility to turn data over. And like I said, we work with law enforcement hand in glove. But sometimes we do feel that law enforcement is taking advantage of antiquated laws to scoop up data. And frankly, if you want to talk about Edward Snowden, we can talk about that too. But let me stop there.
Well, no, actually, please don't. Edward Snowden was not only was that a bellwether. We do a lot of work for DoD contractors.
Yes.
And we are constantly trying to stay abreast of threats, compliance situations. We've got CMMC coming up this year. Well, actually was published this year and is going into effect this year. And Snowden, one, it was a breach of trust for a contractor. But what was exposed? Tell me what your thoughts are about the Snowden situation.
People have different views on, whether he's a hero or a traitor. I think those views, you can certainly have them. But at the end of the day, what happened was our federal government and other governments that we cooperated with were scooping up massive troves of data and analyzing this data without literally anyone's awareness, including Microsoft. We were unaware of what they called PRISM, which was the collection program. And it really changed the way we looked at how we needed to protect and safeguard our data. And it has created some friction with our law enforcement communities around the globe. And we've gotten a lot more strict about it. Microsoft has always called for very robust privacy protections. And this incident and this revelation was really a tipping point for Microsoft. And now, of course, everybody's doing it. But back in those days, and I think, frankly, 911 events and the events after 911, where we were trying to catch terrorists and that kind of thing, we did erode some, shall I say, data protection, and privacy regulations, where this data just became easier and easier to collect. And of course, I keep mentioning these old laws that, frankly, do not address how to protect the data in the cloud.
Right.
Yeah. So you spoke earlier about the importance of safeguarding data, but also safeguarding and protecting trust. And the PRISM revelations really created a fragmentation in the trust between nations, because it wasn't just U.S. citizens, it was everyone that the NSA was collecting data on. And that caused kind of a shakeup. And so last week, the EU struck down Privacy Shield. We'd mentioned that.
Yes.
And so you've talked about this term earlier about Techlash. Do you think that's what we're seeing now? And what is Techlash?
Look, Techlash, we all know that the tech, look, I've mentioned this before, our U.S. economy, it thrives on technology. We have so many leaders in this space, Google, Amazon, Facebook, so many others, of course, Microsoft. But at the end of the day, there's been a growing concern amongst regulators, both abroad and in the U.S., on the power of technology companies, what they do with data. I mean, look at Cambridge Analytica and what happened there on, taking that trove of data and just literally selling it for political gain. So these kinds of things, and I just happened to be reading the Washington Post last night, and I'm just going to read this headline very quickly. This is on the front page of the Washington Post. Big tech is next industry to face Congress's glare. So those are the headlines that we're reading about today. Those are the things that VFI and Microsoft and the entire tech community is involved in. And to put your head in the sand and to think that you may not be affected, or your business model is sound, or this law is never going to impact me is just... I know you have a lot of C-suite listeners on your podcast and engineers alike. These things need to be looked at, addressed. People need to stay smart on them. People need to stay informed. And most importantly, they need to stay engaged.
And so there's a phrase that I hear from many Microsoft employees about drinking the ocean. And for somebody like myself, who I'm just a director of marketing at a medium-sized tech firm, what's that first step? How do you start to build community engagement? Well,
it's kind of like when you found out about your son, you were angry. It was a thing that you were passionate about. You cared about it. And you know what? You did something about it. And that's what we want VFI advocates to do. We want them to, number one, join VFI, because what we will do is give you the tools. We will give you the intelligence from Washington. We will give you training and even programs. And that's something I haven't even focused on yet. But we have programs that get you engaged, that really inspire you and polish your skills as an advocate. And a lot of these programs, frankly, are around diversity and inclusion, or hiring veterans, working with your HR people to see if we can hire veterans who we consider a very underrepresented workforce element that we think deserves a better chance. One thing that we ask you to engage on, Sean, is maybe you can spool up a device donation drive for students during COVID. We have several partners doing that now, because it was a VFI idea that one other partner brought to us. And we said, why don't we just take this across the old ecosystem and see if we can scale this program? But what we do, we urge you to engage in community. We urge you to get smart on the issues, and then, share your passion, speak your voice, and find it.
Great. Thank you so much, David. So just one more time, where can they go to join VFI?
Voicesforinnovation.org.
Excellent. Well, I encourage all of our listeners to do that. David, it has been a delight. I love catching up with you. I love hearing your stories. And I know we barely scratched the surface on some of these stories, but I hope that our listeners out there appreciate and enjoy. Is there anything else you'd like to add right now?
No, I would just say that what you, Agile IT, is doing in the cloud space, and you've always been a valuable Microsoft partner. Thank you for what you're doing. I really look forward to the success of this podcast and the things that you are looking forward on. If there's anything that we can do for you from VFI, for your listeners, for your company, for your vendors, please let us know. And thank you for the opportunity today.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Yes, and thank you very much for joining us, David.
Thank you.
Holy smokes, here comes some really bad tech jokes.
Because it is the 5th birthday of Windows 10. And so you heard Arnold Schwarzenegger was told he needed to upgrade to Windows 10. You know what he said?
No, what?
I still love Vista, baby. Oh, you laughed and you didn't groan. That means it's a good joke. We can't use that one.
Yeah, that one's that one's so bad it's funny.
Well, we're both dads, man. These are dadmin jokes.
Hey, Sean, why did the computer show up at work late?
Why is that?
It had a hard drive.
Oh, yeah, that one's pretty bad. Like, man, that's like something you'd find on a popsicle stick.
Yeah.
All right, we've got a joke from our guest.
A guy offered to document my life in Microsoft Excel, but I said no. I didn't want him to spreadsheet about me.
4, 5, 6, get your fix of some tips and tricks.
So, Conrad, it's tips and tricks. This is our first one. So we don't even need to get deep into it. What is your favorite tip and trick? What's that one tip you've got?
Oh, man, I definitely don't have one. I have many, but this is one that I use every single day. And when I show my screen as I'm working on documents, everybody asks, what is that? So a lot of times when you're working on a Word document, PowerPoint or something, and you have like a bullet or maybe a paragraph, what do? You select it, copy it, move it up someplace, or cut it and move it up and paste it. Instead, wherever your cursor is, so I like to keep my hands on the keyboard, you just hold down Alt, Shift, keep holding those down and hit the up arrow or the down arrow. And that bullet or that paragraph will move up and down. So you can hold Alt Shift, up, let it go. That's where it belongs. It is life-changing if you work with a lot of content.
Yep, I was one of those people who saw you doing it, and I'm like, wait, what was that? Mm-hmm. That's awesome. Where have you been all my life?
Alt Shift, arrow up and down. It's magic.
So I'm going to be a little bit more foundational, and I'm going to say my tip for this week is read the freaking manual. So we did the guest interview. I'm working with audio. I've been doing audio and video editing for 20 years, and I have my workflow. I know exactly what I need to do. And I was just like, oh, man, this is taking me so long. And I did a Google search to see how to use a specific tool. And I found out that I didn't even need to use that tool anymore. There was a new function in the software I was using that did it all for me in 2 minutes. I'd spent 45 minutes going through my normal workflow. So if you're doing like Office migrations, or you're setting up VMware, or building out a new Gmail tenant, whatever, if you've been doing it for 5 years, there are probably better ways to do it. You probably want to go back and read the manual or read some advice and see what the current things are. And I think we all get guilty of that, of I know what I'm doing. And next thing you know, you're 45 and you're doing it the same way you've been doing it your entire life.
Isn't there like a acronym or something that describes this?
Oh, yes. Explain like I'm 5. But maybe that's what we need, is we need a entirely new channel called Explain Like I'm 45.
No, I thought it was
doing
like
it this way, but
I thought it was WTFM.
Oh, yes, RTFM. Yep. What I love is when you're working in Azure or in Microsoft 365 and you're creating policies and they say, create a friendly name. And the first time I saw that, I just started cracking up, because that was how I would tell my son to read the effing manual, was read the friendly manual.
For the friendly manual. That's hilarious.
Right. All right. Well, we have come to the end of our podcast. Conrad, I'm super excited about where we're going to go in the future. We've got some great guests coming up. We've got a former director of the FBI Science and Technology Division who's going to be talking about ethics and AI. Next week, we've got Carrie Lenning from Knowledgeance, who was a former privacy analyst at both Facebook and Palantir. So she's going to be talking about the transfer of data with the EU and building upon what David talked about today with the Cloud Act. And she's going to be talking about how Privacy Shield died and where GDPR and everything else all fits into it. Because as we talked about today, the cloud has no borders. And it's very hard to stay legal on a global scale. So super excited about that. Conrad, thank you so much for being my co-host. Are you as excited as I am, man?
Dude, this is awesome. I mean, David was fantastic. Really, it's the people we're going to bring on to this podcast that really makes it count. So really excited to share that with everybody out there.
Yeah, I'm really excited about this because we do get to talk about bigger things and more of a global scale. This is going to be awesome. Thank you, everybody, for listening. Give us a like and a follow if you're watching us on YouTube. If you're hearing us on all of the podcast networks, you're probably already subscribed. We love you. If you do want to submit questions, go ahead and shoot me an email at sean.s@agileit.com, and I would love to feature some letters on our future podcasts. Once again, thanks a lot and have a great week.
Somewhere